Yes, it's Bill Jones again from Freedom's Nest, brought to you by recapturefederalism.com. Yes, another day at Freedom's Nest. I sure wish the whole country could be a Freedom's Nest like it used to be, but that's not what is happening. What we used to say in the 60s, it's not what haps. It's not what the haps. So today, we're going to have a subject, and before I get into that, we do what we got to do every time. I, William R. Jones, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. So help me God. First took that oath, 1965, July, when I joined the Navy. The enemy was communism then, and it's communism now. I mean, the people don't recognize it. They hide it, cover it up. And you know the cover-up is worse than the crime, so that's what they say. Today's subject: God created Homo sapiens. Communists created blacks. You know, we've got the situation going on here. It's been going on for about since the 60s. Since the early 60s, at least, maybe even a little prior to that. About the time I became an anti-communist in 1960, we talk about the blacks, black nationalist. I'll make reference to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, letter from Birmingham jail, April 1963. If you heard me before, when I say that, I would be remiss if I didn't say where I was at that time. I was a senior. About a month and a half after he wrote that, I graduated from high school. Now, we'll get into that a little bit later, but I'll give you a little intro and why the title and the subject. We have all the stuff going on, you know, around Ferguson, and it's all a big plan, the communist plan anyway. It's been going on for, as I say, decades. And we have this thing with blacks. I said it's the language of communism. It's the language of minorities. It's the language of propaganda and agitation. The guidelines of the Communist Party. There's 8 sections. First one's general, and then you have the other 7. Talks about struggle. There's sections on struggle. Propaganda and agitation, another section. On the party organism. Legal and illegal work. They're criminals. Okay. Party press. Oh yeah, a whole section of party press. How they do it, how they're supported with advertisement, the whole thing. That's from 1921. Of course, that now includes party media, such as Hollywood. And when I say that, I don't mean everybody in Hollywood, and I don't mean everybody in the press. But you get the idea, you know. So we have God created Homo sapiens, communists created blacks. The reason I say that, of course, is that this terminology, blacks and gay, it's all about the same time and the same reasons. The language of the minorities. That's how they agitate and produce propaganda. And the guidelines of the Communist Party, you see all those people marching and the signs and everything. But by the way, that's different than Dr. Martin Luther King, and I'm going to get into that a little later. He did it different. He had a process. Now, I've gone over that in the past. But what you see is the signs and the slogans and that's right out of the guidelines of the Communist parties. And that's where the terminology comes from. God created Homo sapiens. And of course, that's the human race. Now, for those of us who believe in creation, and even me, the Nicene Creed, God created everything visible and invisible. Of course, it was a process. He also created evolution. It's obvious, isn't it? If he created everything, he created evolution. But we have the human race, the Homo sapiens. And there's diversity within there, and there's 3 major races. And I say this, and going back, I remember sociology class in high school. And they talked all about it. Of course, it was in terms of the 1960s. Yeah. There was Negroid, which is what we would consider black or African. Negro is in Spanish black. It's what it is, black. But you just not say anything or say Negro. No, we have to propagandize and agitate, and we use the term black. Yeah, that's what you do. Of course, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx converted to atheism. They came from Christian and Jewish families. In the case of Karl Marx, mother was Jewish, and that side had a line of Jewish rabbis. His father had converted to Lutheranism in Germany. And he was baptized a Lutheran. By the way, little disclosure here, I am a Lutheran, okay? So I understand where he's coming from. Friedrich Engels' mother was the evangelical. I assume a Lutheran. I don't know whether it was Lutheran, but I assume it was Lutheran, because Lutheran and Lutheranism is a Catholic faith and evangelical Catholic faith. So they were atheists, and they don't believe in creation. Now, I'm going to go even a little further than that. I go to the 2 quotes I use all the time, probably every presentation I do. It's critical. It's critical to understand this. These are not my words. These are the words of the Communist, coming out of the manifesto, page 26. There are, besides, eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common in all states of society, but communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to the past historical experience. And I'll say, well, you see that historical experience. What's the historical experience of communism? It's murder, death, starvation, enslavement, re-education camps, internment. Yeah, that's their historical experience. Why? Because they abolish all morality, so they can do whatever they want. Yeah, that's right. The other one, of course, is, and I'm not going to go and quote it, but the forceful overthrow of the existing conditions, social conditions, the new social order. That's really the old communism. Hasn't changed since 1848. Now, I'm going to go into next Martin Luther King and the letter from Birmingham jail. Now, the letter from Birmingham jail, written in 1963, Dr. King was put in jail because they were demonstrating. Local police there thought he was violating the law, and he was. So Dr. King and his, of course, this is one of the famous quotes out there, and there's several, but one of the famous quotes in there is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And he talks about in this letter several areas. It's 48 paragraphs. It's very long. There, he talks about just laws and unjust laws and things of that sort. I have gotten into that in the past and will in the future. I'm not going to do it today because I'm going to key in on another area. In his demonstrations, he had it set up, and I'll quote here, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustice exists, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Okay? And the self-purification is that they trained to take a beat, get beat up, and not to strike back. It was pure nonviolence demonstration. They didn't throw things at police. They didn't yell at police. They didn't do anything like that. There's a case, a Supreme Court case, Edwards versus South Carolina. The decision came about in 1966, but it was about the sit-in demonstrations in the cafeterias down at the 5 and 10 or whatever, Ben Franklin or whatever they were called. I don't know, they might have even been Kresge's back in those days, down in South Carolina. And the Negroes, and that's the term throughout this letter, that's the term that Dr. Martin Luther King uses in relating to the Negro community, the Negroes who were demonstrators, Negroes who were trying to get their voting rights, Negroes who were being discriminated against. It was about, and here's a section in here, which I'm not going to go into today either, about how the Negro had a right to be participant in the Constitution and have the same constitutional rights and be allowed to exercise those same rights as everyone else. Not over and above anybody else, but as everybody else, equal treatment under the law. In 1966, that Edwards versus South Carolina, the court decided and made a decision that silence was freedom of speech. They had a right to assemble and just sit there, not even buy anything. It was a form of petition without saying a word, a redress of their grievances. So you don't have that today, do you? No, today they're blacks, which is the communist term, and that's the forceful overthrow of government. That's part of that forceful overthrow. Where Dr. Martin Luther King talks about blacks, there's 2 paragraphs, and I'm going to read them. And it's interesting. It relates to black nationalists, black Muslims, communist, and that's what black nationalism is. And he wrote, "You speak of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see any nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that standing in the middle of 2 opposing forces in the Negro community, one is the force of complacency, made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation, and in part of a few middle-class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation, have become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up across the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement, nourished by Negroes' frustration over the continuing existence of racial discrimination. This movement is made up of people who have lost faith in America and who have absolutely repudiated Christianity and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible, quote, devil, unquote. And the next paragraph. I have tried to stand between these two forces, saying that we need to emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complainant nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalist, for there is more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. Wow, what a message. And it's a message that relates today. Love and hate, good and evil. And what you see on the streets of Ferguson and New York and other cities, those demonstrations are no longer the demonstrations of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King of love, but they're demonstrations of hatred, because communism is hatred. They abolish all eternal truths. They abolish all religions and all morality. What a definition for hatred that is. And he says it. Hatred and despair. Black nationalist. Interestingly enough, a disclaimer here, I suppose. The black Muslims were formed in Detroit in the 1930s by Elijah Muhammad. In the 50s, they moved to Chicago, and that's where their headquarters were. In Hyde Park, North Kenwood neighborhoods, that area. That's where I grew up at. And in the mid-50s, I remember probably around 1955, I was 10 years old, thereabouts, walking down the street with my mother and noticed these people. Of course, women had the Muslim garb. The men were always dressed spiffy, with bow ties, suits, shirts, white shirts. They looked good. There was some rough talk from Elijah Muhammad and the black Muslims. But at that time, there never seemed to be any violence coming out of them at that point. That came later. And their involvements with street gangs that are now considered terrorism as of 2012 by a legislative finding of the Illinois General Assembly. Yes, that's the violence came later. And the violence came from people like Jesse Jackson. Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in America. And it's not an accident. And it wasn't segregated by whites. It was segregated by the likes of Jesse Jackson. And when you hear Jesse Jackson and Sharpton, I no longer call them Reverend because I have no respect for them. They're communist, agitators, propaganda, class struggle, warfare, psych ops, lawfare. Just let it be known that's what they are. But we have a press that won't tell you that. They cover it up. And covering up is always worse than the crime. And that's where we're at. Before I leave, a little advertisement. I'd like to have you come to the website, recapturefederalism.com, and subscribe. Join in. You can continue hearing some of these presentations. We'd like to have you join me. Hear some more. Spread the word. recapturefederalism.com. Good day.